Hello. I've been asked today to talk to you about nothing about us without us as the principle in disability activism and disability scholarship. So, where does it come from? Well, I think we have to acknowledge that in the past, disabled people were spoken for. So, who were they spoken for by? Well, firstly, families. Parents and other family members have always thought that they should be able to, in the best interests of the disabled person, dictate what they do or what happens to them. There's this idea that if you have an impairment of body or mind, you may be less capable of speaking for yourself. So disabled people in many legal codes are not considered to be capable of forming contracts, which might be holding property or even getting married, because disabled people cannot speak for themselves, cannot agree for themselves. So in an effort to protect disabled people, families, communities, law codes have excluded disabled people by saying that their voice does not count or need not be heard. As well as the parents and so forth, we also need to talk about professionals. Because again, legal, medical, educational, scientific, and other professionals, because of their great knowledge of many of the circumstances surrounding disability, have said or have proved through publication that they are the experts, that they know best about perhaps impairments or body systems or educational capacities or whatever else. And therefore, they should say what should happen with disabled people, what solutions are best for disabled people. And if that is the historical background, then where do the voices of disabled people come through? Well, in the post-war period, there was the welfare state in many countries. And the welfare state has been challenged mainly during the 50s and 60s and 70s by groups of people who've been excluded from it. Groups of people like in America, the civil rights movement, saying, you have excluded us. Black people, African Americans are not heard, are not able to vote, are excluded, are segregated, and we want an end to that. And following the civil rights movement of African Americans, women in the 60s and 70s and onwards articulated to demand a voice. We are not merely the married, we're not merely mothers, but we are citizens able to speak in our own right. It's not enough to have the formal vote, which in Britain was won in 1928, but it's also necessary to be able to be doctors, students, lawyers, politicians, and all the rest of it alongside men. And so the women's movement put the voice of women centre stage and said certain aspects, certain issues, abortion or pornography or motherhood or whatever else, are of particular importance to women. And in the wake of the women's movement, the movement for lesbian and gay equality in the 70s and 80s said, again, we have been excluded. We demand to be heard. We demand to speak for ourselves. We demand an end to the medicalization of homosexuality, for example. The American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of medical conditions in 1970. So, again, lesbian and gay movements have argued for autonomy, to be heard, to be part of the political process. And from the 70s and 80s onwards, disabled people, persons with disabilities, did exactly the same, saying, listen to us, saying we are credible witnesses to our own lives, saying that the lived experience of disability is vital to knowing and saying what needs to happen for disabled people. Our priorities should predominate, not what is thought to be our priorities. And in the 1970s, a group of disabled people came together in Britain to demand to be heard. And it started, I think, in 1970 with a letter to the Guardian newspaper, a liberal newspaper, suggesting the formation of a consumer group of people with disabilities. And from that letter came the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And by calling it the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, these founders of the UK disability movement were saying that they wanted to be political, that they were united. It doesn't matter about the different impairments, they were united across the board, and they demanded to be heard. And they entered into dialogue with the Disability Alliance, which is really more paternalistic, experts, academic experts, aiming to speak for disabled people. And UPIA said no. The Disability Alliance had it wrong. That disability was imposed on top of impairment by a society which excluded. And these fundamental principles, published in 1976, became the social model of disability. That all disabled people have something in common, which is oppression, which is created by a social world which excludes them. People are disabled by society, not by their bodies. And so disability became, particularly in America, a minority group idea. People like Harlan Hahn in America promoted the idea that disabled people belonged in the same tradition as the civil rights struggle of African Americans. And these ideas, the ideas of disability being created by society, the ideas of disability as a minority experience, came to be enshrined in, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Disability Discrimination Act in the United Kingdom in 1995, and of course the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was accepted by the United Nations in 2006 and came into force on the 3rd of May 2008. And this this treaty, which almost all the countries of the world have now ratified, says, look, disabled people have rights because they're human beings, but those rights are not normally met. And so in 50 articles, the CRPD enshrines all of the areas of life that we think are important: health, education, international cooperation, and so forth, access, attitudes, awareness, it's all there. And what was very important in the CRPD was Article 12, which states that disabled people have legal capacity on an equal basis with others. And really this is about this right to be heard, this right to be the expert on your own lives. So when we see, for example, assistive technology, we need to understand what disabled people want, how they live, what is most useful to them. Because in the field of assistive technology, a lot of devices are not used because they're not what the disabled person wants. And if you ask them, you are more likely to end up with a solution that matters and is used by them. So it's about cost effectiveness. It's about achieving your outcomes. Everything is better if you listen to disabled people. If disabled people are partners with you in developing the resource, the technology, the product, the service that you want to provide equally to them. So that's the sort of headlines, if you like, for Nothing About Us Without Us. But I want to also sort of slightly problematize it. And one way that I problematize it is thinking, okay, we agree that, for example, an actor with disability is best able to portray the reality of living with that disability. But when it comes to non-disabled people, what is their role? And I want to say here that we need a division of labour. So, for example, I'm a disabled person, I've got multiple impairments. If I want a plumber, I don't expect them to be disabled. In fact, I don't care. If I want an accountant, if I want a lawyer, I might think, all right, it'd be great to have a disabled lawyer, but it's not my primary consideration. What I need is for the lawyer, the accountant, the plumber, the doctor to know their trade and to listen to me. So as long as they're prepared to listen to what I want, to what I need, to what I experience, I'm prepared to accept their expertise in a matter pertaining to my life. So a doctor might know better than I what the evidence says is a good outcome in terms of this operation for my spinal cord injury. And I should listen to them. It's not about saying, just listen to me, I'm disabled, I'm the expert. It's about understanding they have expertise that is relevant to my life. It is their duty to give me choices and control, to outline the possibilities, their areas of doubt, and to leave it to me to decide. But it is not for me to say that I know best of orthopedics, of plumbing, of accountancy, or whatever, because clearly I don't. So we need a division of labour between experts through profession or through academia, and experts with lived expertise, this personal experience, expertise by experience. We need both. And similarly, it applies to the role of parents and family. It has to be, unlike in the past, that parents and family listen to disabled people who've experienced schooling, who've experienced assistive technology, who've experienced various solutions. But although there is a duty to listen, we need to say that most disabled people spend most of their lives with family and friends who are non-disabled. And therefore, they're not going to be in some sort of disabled, segregated utopia. They're going to live with non-disabled people, and therefore they need alliances. They need to have parents, siblings, wives and husbands, partners who are listening to them, but also who they trust, who are able to deliver things that they need. So I want disabled people to be autonomous, but not autarkic. We are not self-sufficient. We need to collaborate with others. Now, in the disability movement and in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in a lot of our contemporary human rights practice, we see the importance of organisations of people with disabilities. And I think this is very important. I think that when people come together, there is a consciousness raising. There is an ability to think through problems. There is campaigning for the rights of persons with disabilities. There is sometimes direct delivery of services, particularly in low middle income countries where the government is unable to provide services. Sometimes an organisation of persons with disabilities does that. So I want to stress the importance of organisations of persons with disabilities. But I also want to say another thing, that's not enough. Because from all the surveys and research that we've done at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, members of organisations of persons with disabilities, only about 10% of disabled people as a whole. So if you take the whole population of persons with disabilities who would feature in the convention or in legal representation, only 10% are members of organisations of persons with disabilities. And sometimes organisations of persons with disabilities are not representative of that wider population. They may be more privileged, more middle class, more urban. So I don't think we can automatically assume that organisations of persons with disabilities are representative, do speak for everybody. They may be the only voice we've got, and we must hear them, but we cannot rest, if you like, on our laurels. And we can do two things to try and improve the voice of persons with disabilities. Firstly, I think it's really incumbent on organisations of persons with disabilities to consult and include. They should not rely on a few activists in their city who are particularly privileged. outreach, inclusion, participation are as important for organizations of persons with disabilities as they are for everybody else. And they need funding to do this. They need to be supported to do this. But reaching more people, explaining the convention, explaining minority group or human rights or social models of disability is really, really important, because so many disabled people do not have access to this, do not have this understanding, may not have sign language, may not be heard for all sorts of reasons. Therefore, we need to reach out and include so that organizations of persons with disabilities are truly representative. And the second thing I think is very important, and it's mentioned in Article 31 of the Convention, is research, is good data, are good statistics. Because as researchers, we try to obtain representative samples of the wider population, including of the wider population of persons with disabilities. And in so doing, we can understand better what are their concerns, what are their experiences. And I think that too much human rights work, and indeed academic work, operates without inclusion of persons with disabilities, because only by asking, only by exploring, can we understand the full range of issues that are really important, or the full range of outlooks that pertain for persons with disabilities. And I want to say one thing about that, because if you read the activism, it might suggest that health is not an issue, that impairment or health condition is not an issue. But if you do research, for example, if you do qualitative research, you find out straight away that disabled people are interested and concerned about their health conditions, about their symptoms, about achieving proper health medical response, and they're concerned about the barriers they face, about negative attitudes, about discrimination. They're concerned about both. And I think that activism and academia has to ensure the voices of disabled people, the participation of disabled people in both responses to health conditions and responses to discriminatory barriers. Because otherwise, disabled people are left to experience pain, restriction, all forms of illness and impairment without collective voice, without consciousness raising, without hearing from other people. Because my experience as a disabled person is I have had very, very many conversations about just this, about discomfort, about pain, about sleepless nights, about difficulties of impairment with other disabled people. And I remember in particular a dear friend who I love dearly, who's now passed away, and he and I were having this conversation about the pain and discomfort of disability. And then we went and we spoke at a public meeting, and he didn't speak at all about what we had spoken about. He instead talked about the social model of disability. He talked about how people are disabled by society. He talked about how we should have social change and this will empower disabled people. And I said to him afterwards, I said, hang on a minute, you and I were talking about pain and difficulty, but when you went out in public, you didn't talk about that at all. You just talked about social barriers. He said to me, and I always remember this, he said to me, yes, I know. Pain and difficulty are problems for disabled people. You know that, I know that, but I'm not going to go out in public and say that. And I think that this is wrong. I think we need to be clear about the whole range of experiences that disabled people have. Not just the experiences of discrimination and barriers, but also the experiences of pain and discomfort and functional limitation and the frustrations of our impairments, because they are part of our lives. When we do qualitative research, that is what people talk about. They do not make this sort of convenient distinction that we often see in the academic literature between impairment on the one hand and disability on the other hand. They don't think that impairment is socially constructed and therefore not real. They experience both. They experience health restrictions and they experience stigma and barriers in society. So our research, our activism, our advocacy has to include both. I think it is a political issue to say, if we are to have nothing about us without us, then disabled people need access to, need to be included in provision of assistive technology, rehabilitation, healthcare, and all these other areas. Because, for example, we've done research about rehabilitation, which is a neglected issue within disability rights. If you look at the disability studies literature, it very rarely mentions rehabilitation. And correspondingly, if you look at the rehabilitation sciences literature, it very rarely mentions the voices of disabled people. And I think there's been this rift. I think disability activism and research should mention rehabilitation and assistive technology, because for many disabled people, they're absolutely vital to leading a better life. And I think, on the other hand, rehabilitation sciences, the whole literature about therapies, assistive technology, and all the rest of it, has to mention the voices of disabled people. It's as if nothing has changed over the last 30 years, but it has changed. Disabled people articulating their voices for themselves, nothing about us without us. And rehabilitation sciences has to take into account that idea. So, I hope that in this talk I have shown you how complicated nothing about us without us can be. I hope that I've promoted the importance of advocacy and organisations of persons with disabilities. I hope I've also said we need to research the complexities of life, both using qualitative and quantitative methods. And I've said that in both, we will find that disability is a multifaceted experience. If nothing about us is to be real, we need to talk about our experiences of impairment as well as our experiences of disability. We need to talk about the whole range of impacts on disabled people, because only by talking about it can we understand it, and only by understanding it can we do something about it. Can we improve the lives of persons with disabilities? And that is what we are all about, whether we are professionals or parents and family members or civil servants and policymakers or teachers, doctors and all those other things, or disabled people themselves and our organisations. We all have this common objective, which is to improve and support the lives of persons with disabilities. So we need to find out what they think. We need to find out what the science says. And then we need to bring people together to discuss, to have a discourse about this challenge, whether it be in assistive devices, whether it be in physical activity, whether it be in rehabilitation or any other area of life. Because only by including all these different voices, foremost among them disabled people, will we have a chance to understand and act and, importantly, change the lives of disabled people in our country and across the world forever and for the better. Thank you very much for listening.